We are continuing the discussion, but entering a more specific realm of cultural production and art production. So discussing somehow same topic. This is generally the idea of survival in the context of probably approaching or threatening ecological catastrophe and generally the problems with environment. I also hope that we will manage to discuss these general concepts like the concept of nature, concept of society that we have been mentioning all the time, precisely from the same perspective. And of course, I also hope that we will come to the general problem of what this title that is covering, so to say, all these discussions, former West, the idea of former West, that is still vague and at the same time very challenging for us. How this relates to these topics and to these problems. We have, although you see 4 persons, but 3 presenters, so to say. TJ Demos, who comes from London. He is a critic, a theorist, a curator. He teaches also in London. For more information, just look at the biographies. They are here. Fowkes, Maja and Reuben Fowkes come from Budapest. Both are trained art historians and deal with the problems in their research, with the problems, and curators also of environment and sustainability. And Marina Vishmidt also comes from London, critic, theorist, and art critic. So we have almost like 3 originally coming from London or Britain. And the first, I'm inviting TJ Demos to open this discussion with your presentation, please.
Thanks very much, Boris, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to give a presentation that draws on my current research toward a book project that I'm working on right now, which is about ecology. It's provisionally titled The Post-Natural Condition, Contemporary Art, Visual Culture, and the Politics of Ecology. And that should be finished up in the fall and hopefully out next year if all goes well. And particularly I'm going to talk about the context of India in relationship to these questions, because that will be one of the chapters of my book project. So we're looking at an image by the Delhi-based artist and NGO founder and environmental activist Ravi Agrawal, who has looked into the situation of vultures in India and the catastrophic extinction or near extinction of this species, where the country has seen nearly 90% of vultures die out over the last decade or so, owing to the use of a pharmacological agent, diclofenac, in animal dairy production, basically, with a very heavy use in the cow population in India. So just in terms of this engagement, it puts it dramatizes the significance of talking about and thinking about survival today. That is, in the context of what some scientists are referring to as the mass species extinction event that we're living through right now, when we could see up to, or even more, 50% of animals, plants, and birds who are predicted to be lost by the end of this current century, owing to human-caused habitat loss, pollution, climate change, etc. So survivalism, in terms of a first go, means the imperative to study the conditions of extinction. Many people have been doing this for the time now, and I'm very interested in this discourse of extinction. For instance, there's Elizabeth Kolbert's recent text, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History, that just came out, which I've been looking into, that she's looking at the different sciences and the kinds of losses that have been going on already and that are continuing amidst many of the animal populations worldwide. There's also a variety of responses to extinction that I'm interested in and curious about, including the voluntary human extinction movement with their logo, "May we live long and die out," which was founded in 1991 by this guy Les Knight, who's an American activist who became very interested in the environmental movement in the 1970s, and particularly in the deep ecology movement with its interest in complete biocentric equality. And formed this group, and as you can see, it brings out the potentially or largely misanthropic elements of one approach to extinction. A much more interesting formation, I think, is the Extinction Studies Working Group, which is more of a theoretical and interdisciplinary formation based in Australia with figures like Tom Van Doren and Deborah Bird-Rose, whom Catherine Gibson just mentioned, and Donna Haraway and others, which is a more recent formation put together in the last few years that is part of a move toward thinking about a non-anthropocentric biopolitics, coming out of a concern for, again, biocentric equality between human and non-human life forms, but without that added misanthropic dimension of calling for voluntary human extinction. So this group raises a series of questions that I'm very interested in thinking about that become, I think, important and relevant to an ongoing dialogue about survival, such as, how should we love in a time of extinction? What would a multi-species ethics be in a time of select survivalism, when, for instance, charismatic animals are protected, but so-called unloved others, such as vultures, are left to their own devices, even while they remain crucial for the survival of countless other species, including human beings? And what would it mean to practice a compassionate immersion in the lives of others within a multi-species community, including the dead as well as the living? So this is something that Ravi Agarwal looks at with his investigation of the extinction or the near extinction of vultures in India, where he finds this is bringing about a profound impact on the web of life, of codependence between multi-species life forms, which encourages a regress of death or double or triple death, or a cyclical echo of deaths as one species dies out, and it has tremendous impact as the ramifications and the toxins enter the food chain, and other species die out as a result. So for Agarwal, vultures, in a way, have become mere representations of what was once a common form of life in India, and so he's very interested in investigating this further. I'm just going to give you very brief descriptions of the practices, but I wanted to call attention to this because I think it establishes the significance of dealing with survivalism at this moment. So, faced with the time of extinction in an age of ecological catastrophe, we experience an unprecedented imperative to think of what survival means. So I'd like to turn now to what survival might mean and what models there are within cultural and ecological political practices, again in the Indian context. And here I'd like to turn to Amar Kanwar's recent installation called The Sovereign Forest from 2012. This was presented at a number of places, European venues, including Documenta, the most recent Documenta. However, I think it's most interesting to look at this project as it's presented in Bhubaneswar, in Orissa, in East India, where it's set up as a permanent installation and it's presented within the context of a larger project that's called Samadrushti, which is a community center, a source of independent media, and a video editing workshop. So it operates in a very different, and I think in a really much more interesting way within this local context. Within this very complex installation that includes films and handmade books and a documentary archive of records and material evidence relating to the crimes against the environment and village and indigenous life in East India, owing to the onslaughts of basically corporate neoliberalism and various forms of extractivism and deforestation. The interest in bauxite mining, which is the material related to aluminum, is really crucial in this area, and it's causing immense hardship and difficulty, conflict and death within the area. But amidst this installation, he presents 272 varieties of rice, as you see in those small boxes mounted on the wall. And those rice varieties are an attempt to reclaim the traditional heritage of the seeds commons within India against the types of privatization of life forms as is practiced by corporations like Monsanto that develop GM crops and attempt to patent life forms as a form of intellectual property and source of the accumulation of wealth. And this has, of course, I'm sure you're aware of this, but it's had a disastrous effect on Indian small-scale subsistence farmers. And part of Amar's installation is to present these 272 varieties of rice that have been reclaimed within recent practices of organic agriculture in India. And in doing so, he calls attention to the work of a diversity of farmers, but particularly this guy, Natbar Sarangi, who's an organic farmer whom you see here in his fields, who's lived through the Green Revolution in India, that is referring to the post-1960s development of modernizing agriculture and technological and chemical-based agribusiness, and has come to reject them because he's seen the disastrous effects in relationship to the economy, the social life of small-scale farmers, and in terms of the depletion and ruination of the soil. So he has committed himself to growing as many varieties of indigenous native seeds for rice that he can get his hands on, and to share this widely with local and regional small-scale farmers. So in a way, it's a living archive as well as a seeds commons for the practice of a native indigenous agriculture. So of course, this kind of work is posed against the growth of terminator seeds and GM crops within India. And what we have then is a conflict between what we might call a biopolitics of survival, posed against a thanato or necropolitics of corporate neoliberalism, obsessed with development and the accumulation of wealth above all else, to the point where, as someone like Noam Chomsky has explained, even the survival of the species is an externality to the capitalist agenda. This comes from a Canadian campaign against GM seeds. So Kanwar's installation then juxtaposes the human cost of Indian neoliberal developmentalism, which, as I mentioned before, is bound, or one would suspect that this is bound to get worse under the new regime of Hindu nationalist BJP leader Narendra Modi, who's just elected as prime minister. So that's posed against the hopefulness of spreading development of ecological sustainability, social equity, and economic survival, as represented in the kind of agroecology and earth democracy of not only Natbar Sarangi, but also figures like Vandana Shiva, and her, and her group, Earth Democracy. So this raises the question of development. What does development mean? Which is an incredibly charged term, and of course has encountered a critical discourse for decades now. But basically, it's this. I'm interested in how the conflictual definitions of development play out in the struggle between life and death in relationship to the definition of nature. That is, the value of nature and the nature of value. Whether nature, for instance, is valued according to an economic calculus, according to the terms of green capitalism, which advances an agenda of natural capital or carbon credits or debt for nature swaps, and a whole host of mechanisms to bring about the financialization of nature. We're still living in the midst of this when it seems that any address of the conditions of ecological catastrophe can only begin within the framework of free market economy. So this is a major problem. So the conflict then is between that model and another model, which is that which sees nature as a site of intrinsic value, as a form of sovereignty, of biocentric equality between species, part of an entangled whole that is beyond and outside of the economy. As in cases of, for instance, Indian subsistence farmers and activists and indigenous groups, such as the Dangriya Kond, who live in East India in Orissa, who worship their mountains and rivers as dwellings of the divine and as the seat of life, rather than seeing it as a factory of natural resources and financial profit. A further way to pose the difference between values of nature and the nature of value is within legal philosophy. And there's a connection here to indigeneity as well, which I'll get to in a second. And here I'm thinking of the emergence of a wild law and earth jurisprudence, which is an international movement in legal ways of thinking about the rights of nature. It sees nature as a subject, not an object, but a subject of legal standing, in order to transcend the position of nature being an object of human exploitation. And this is a website of one of the formations around wild law. Vandana Shiva is involved in this. Also, the writer Cormac Cullinan is one of the key figures within the development of wild law. So this, as far as I understand it, constitutes a legal revolution, transforming jurisprudence from a market-centered basis to one that is biocentric, recognized as such recently in the changes to, for instance, the Bolivian and Ecuadorian constitutions, which now recognize the law of the rights of Mother Earth. Vandana Shiva, in fact, is one of a number of international activists, including others such as Nima Bassi of Nigeria, who are involved in a recent legal challenge to BP, British Petroleum, against the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, bringing the corporation to court in Ecuador and working toward a new conception of what Vandana Shiva calls earth democracy in her Navdanya project in India. This framework is importantly increasingly investigated by at least some artists and practitioners of visual culture and research architecture. I'm thinking of, for instance, the World of Matter collective, especially the work of members like Uwe Martin and Ursula Biemann and Paulo Tavares, who Tavares and Biemann have explored this Ecuadorian context of what they call forest law in a recent video project of theirs that you see a still of here. They're having an exhibition on right now at the Dortmund Media Kunstverein, which is, I think, a very interesting development. And they also have a really useful open access web platform where you can look more at their materials. So what then is the relation of and this now I'm looking at the ramifications and the conceptual elements of this rights to nature discourse. So what's the relation of rights to nature to post-natural discourse of speculative realism? For instance, of the kind of proposals that you find in books by Timothy Morton and also Bruno Latour, right? So the rights of nature and the call to abandon nature as a conceptual category. For example, how to think ecology without nature, to invoke Tim Morton's book. So for me, there's not necessarily a contradiction here. At least in my work, this is how I'm thinking about it. Because both, in effect, reject the outmoded notion of a nature as an isolated category set apart from human activities. The legal formalization of the rights of nature, in fact, very much exemplifies the complex entanglement of the environment and geology in legal, economic, social, and technological systems, corresponding to, for example, Bruno Latour's notion of hybrids or Morton's notion of hyper-objects. And it also conforms to recent discussions of the Anthropocene. Both the rights of nature discourse and post-natural philosophy, in effect, equally reject the former nature of the former West. What then is the next step ahead? One important move would be to proceed from a discussion of animism, and I'm thinking about Anselm Franke's exhibition project. So to move from that to, say, becoming indigenous, of a project like Jim Clifford's. That is the need to move from a project that is mostly concerned with deconstructing the Western paradigm of the separations between categories of nature and culture, that is to bring formerness increasingly to the West. Also to deconstruct the categories of object, subject, or person, thing, human, non-human, right? And move toward seeing indigeneity, not as an exotic other or enclosed within a colonial mode of Western reason, but rather to see indigeneity as a resource for survival in a time of extinction, of economic and ecological crisis, one that importantly places humans on the list of the threatened and endangered, not only, in other words, not only animals. That is, we need to recognize traditional knowledge as part of a human heritage, as argue people like Vandana Shiva, in relation to how to survive amidst changing climatological shifts, where the urgency of survival has long been experienced by native peoples threatened with genocide or assimilation. So native peoples have been dealing with survival for hundreds of years now. So becoming indigenous is a term that is contained within James Clifford's recent work, where he sees it as a destabilized term increasingly, recognizing in it nativism as much as mobility, emerging out of histories of dispossession, colonialism, resistance, and survival, which is now a site increasingly of international mobilization. For instance, if you look at the formation of Idle No More in 2013, inviting not so much the difference of an outmoded form of identity politics, and more a reading of a call to, as the text explains, a call to all people to join in a revolution of solidarity. So how this solidarity might work is crucial, I think, to think about. And for me, it corresponds. It provides one proposal to what Bruno Latour calls for in terms of the key element or the key imperative of political ecology, which is to work toward the progressive composition of a common world, which we must work for if we are to survive at all. So what I like finally, in conclusion, about Amar Kanwar's project is that it presents an arrangement of images and objects and sounds that reflect on our material basis in the world. It presents a way of becoming indigenous, where indigeneity constitutes a process of survival, of learning how to live in a world with others and within our living environment. It's not, in this sense, a modernist going primitive or anything like that, but rather a way of reinventing a way of being and belonging in the world of commonality and survivability. As well, it's created by a city-based artist, he's based in Delhi, who has come to criticize what he calls the many faces of madness, of global neoliberalism, of corporate capitalism, of India's developmentalism, and to explore ways of becoming indigenous through its affects, biopolitics, ecology, and sociability, which for me offers a compelling proposition and a welcoming invitation. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Oh, just maybe we can just get it.
Do you need the mic? We have one. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Boris, for the introduction, and thank you to Maja and Bach for the invitation to be part of the former West, and at this very interesting moment with this shift to these new questions around survivalism and future vocabularies. As you already heard, we're art historians and curators, and we also have a kind of institutional form in the sense that last year we set up the Translocal Institute in Budapest, where we're based. That's after quite a lot of years of working together as Translocal through a kind of online platform of our website. And just the name Translocal. Just to mention that in human geography, translocality is very, very much associated with this idea of being situated in many different locales at the same time, and the idea that this being translocal then gives you a kind of a comparative perspective, which in this context might also have an affirmative potential.
So our personal localities have already been mentioned. This is the former west capital of London and the former east capital of Budapest. And we work with questions of art and ecology, both in terms of art historical research and also through our curatorial practice. And actually we've been dealing with this issue since we started to work together in the early 2000s. And over the time we figured out that our method of work is Don Quixote style.
And that's maybe we'll come out more as we're talking, but like dealing with art and ecology in this region of Eastern Europe, it's a region in which is very much connected to the political. Always comes out, and what we're interested in exploring is how these political histories are also connected to environmental histories, and the story of that for Eastern Europe really starts with Stalinism, and the whole kind of Stalinist attitude to nature, and thinking about Eastern Europe rather than just the Soviet Union after the Second World War, the imposition of this Stalinist attitude to nature across the whole region. And in a way, it's somehow symbolized by the 1948 great Stalinist plan for the transformation of nature, which entailed really megalomaniac plans to straighten rivers and plant very extensive forest belts to change the course of the winds and change the whole ecology in a kind of Anthropocene style across the whole Soviet Union. And it was based on this idea that nature, the state really had to dominate nature, that seeing nature as almost as a class enemy.
So Stalinist approach can also be seen as an extreme example of the modernist view that nature is just a resource for human exploitation. And then there is the question of how these policies were disseminated across countries of Eastern Bloc, and through the ideology that pollution is a problem of the capitalist West and cannot occur under the socialist system. And so they were on one hand denying possibility of pollution, on the other hand they were blocking any information about ecological discourse and the actual state of the environment in each of the countries, although in different ways. But then by the 1980s it became very obvious that you cannot ignore the pollution and the problems, environmental problems that occurred under the socialist system in the countries of Eastern Bloc. And it became such a radical force of the uprisings during the 1980s that actually it was an important element in bringing down the communist system. And in many first elections after the fall of communism, Green parties figured very importantly.
And in terms of thinking about former West, former East and former West, it's very significant that 1989, the breaking down of the divide between East and West, symbolized by the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, was also the moment, also created a space in which it became possible to think about ecology on a more global scale. And it was also the era of the rise of the idea of sustainability associated with the Brundtland Report of '87 and then leading up to the Rio Summit of 1992. And what happened after that? So this was kind of moment of hope that the world might take ecological crisis seriously. But after the end of the Cold War, what we saw was the evaporation of this sense of environmental optimism and really the return of the power of economic forces, as we've heard, of neoliberal capitalism.
And so in Eastern Europe, this roller coaster of transition that happened, the environmental issues were very soon superseded with the consumerist promises of capitalism. But in the Old West at the same time, these were then changed and hijacked by the renewed round of economic growth under the banner of the green capitalism that we faced. So we could see maybe these waves where environmental issues surfaced up, and one of these was '89. Obviously, we were talking a lot yesterday about early 70s, and this was the time when, in 60s and 70s, where ecology really became a global issue and people really started to talk about it. But after '89, it went quiet, or it turned into the streams we didn't really want to think about. And now, again, after the economic crisis, not immediately, but over the few years of thinking about environmental crisis, we came again to think about ecological issues, and new concepts and new thoughts have surfaced again.
Okay, so turning again to the kind of socialist context and history, it might be useful to look at the work of dissident Czech philosopher Milan Šimečka, who was based in Bratislava. And what's interesting about him is, despite having lived through this very harsh period of normalization in Czechoslovakia after the brutal suppression of the Prague Spring in '68, he didn't kind of totally lose his utopian orientation, but somehow it shifted from a more socialist or neo-Marxist orientation to utopianism to a more ecological one, which is also interesting from the point of view of the 80s. And so he was asked, like, how did he see utopia today in the mid 80s, in '84, and he said, "Today the world is in such a state that it needs new utopias. None of the serious problems facing mankind can be solved by mere pragmatism. We can already witness the great vitality of utopia, which is trying to preserve for mankind unpolluted air, water, forests and seas, everything that is still left of nature, which has been sacrificed to another utopia, that of prosperity."
Okay, so this is an open editorial meeting, and we're bringing some things in which we are happy to take further. But this is where he's speaking from Eastern Europe, from a very disadvantaged position, and he talks about the need to preserve what is left of nature. In the same time, in the West, the critical theories of the 1980s, it was clear that there was nothing left of nature, and that the nature as such does not exist. And the idea that still requires a considerable amount of time in conferences and discussions, and could be seen as particularly resistant residue of linguistic and post-structuralist debate that still color discussions of ecological crisis and climate change.
And in a way, the inadequacies of theory to respond to ecological crisis were also outlined by Dipesh Chakrabarti in a text, I think, which has already been mentioned this morning, his essay on the climate of history, where he states, "As the crisis gathered momentum in the last few years, I realized that all my readings in theories of globalization, Marxist analysis of capital, subaltern studies, and post-colonial criticism over the last 25 years, while enormously useful in studying globalization, had not really prepared me for making sense of this planetary conjuncture within which humanity finds itself today." And perhaps we could delegate these ecologically non-attuned theories to this overriding concept of the critical legacies of the former West.
So if we return to Šimečka's call to salvage, as he put it, what is still left of nature, a proposition voiced from the social, political, environmental complexities of the former East that disrupts and destabilizes the simplistic accepted categories and divides, not just between East and West, but also between North and South. The fact that Šimečka's notion of what is still left of nature did not arise in the global South, where perhaps the affirmative connotations of nature were more often based on still integrated experiences with the natural environment, but in the former East, it could be said that it destabilizes the common assumption of the post-colonial discourse about the existence of unified Eurocentric position.
When actually maybe it's necessary to distinguish between East and West within Europe, also between North and South, as we talked about a little bit about yesterday. And as a matter of fact, when a consortium of European NGOs launched the project Rewilding Europe quite recently, they actually, what they discovered is that what is still left of nature is actually seems to be located primarily or to a great extent in former Eastern Europe. For example, on their map of the areas that they want to carry out this project of rewilding in, there's the Danube Delta, the Velebit Mountains in Croatia, the Eastern Carpathians in Romania, as well as the Western Carpathians also around Poland and Slovakia. And the mission of rewilding then is to return areas to nature and allow natural processes to take over, and also to create the conditions where you can introduce these megafauna, these very big animals, a more dynamic nature that used to exist on the European continent. But before they could take any action, and maybe this also comes back to the idea of vocabularies, they really needed to define what is wilderness, because that's a term which is disputed as much as nature is. And being the EU, they had various committees and meetings, and they came up with a very practical definition that wilderness is a place where natural processes rule, followed by a footnote which over 3 pages explaining all the detailed conditions of conduct and so on, including what's the rules for research in wilderness areas. And it really is this question of what is still left of wilderness, or where there is still a potential for it. It's very closely related to the debates that are going on today about post-humanism, post-anthropocentrism, and also this whole idea of the age of the Anthropocene that we're in. And these are all questions that have been touched upon or examined to an extent in the River School project that we've been working on over the last year and is ongoing through 2014.
But before we talk a little bit about this thing or our curatorial practice in that sense, we would also like to make some references also to our art historical research in the region, and to show some practices which could be maybe seen as a precedence for such approaches in the work of the neo-avant-garde artists from Eastern Europe, where we can find some clear echoes of contemporary debates around the issues that we mentioned. And also it is very interesting, and Boris asked us to think also about the mechanisms of the art world. So we will show some provocative, I hope, examples of how the artist dealt with the art world. So
certain aspects of the practice of the OHO group in Slovenia could be particularly relevant here. In the late 60s, they were very much concerned with the potential of reism the meaning of which originates from this idea of a thing, which maybe also might refer in the future somehow to Latour. And they're very interested in this kind of non-hierarchical approach to objects. That you could assign all different objects in the world should be assigned the same kind of value, meaning and value. And Marko Pogacnik, one of the members of the group, later actually described this as a post-anthropocentric approach to art. They soon moved to working outdoors and at the same time started to explore the meaning of working collectively through the practice of schooling, where they would spend a whole day immersed in group activities in a natural setting. In the Three Ecologies, a key book in thinking about the environment and so on that people clearly refer to a lot, Felix Guattari pointed to the need to reconstruct the modalities of group being in order to counteract the effects of environmental, social, as well as mental pollution. And he also stated that this needs to be reconstructed not just through communicational interventions, but through existential mutations. And we think that Oho's experiments with group exercises, which happened in parallel to their quite successful career in Yugoslavia, but also internationally, they were in the first, in the MoMA exhibition Information in 1970. The way that this kind of approach led them to abandon the institutional art world and take the decision to found a rural commune, where they could live without the restraints of an oppressive society and also outside of the rules and conformism of the art world.
So we have, this was horrible for art critics and art historians in Yugoslavia. They just had this perfect artist group doing conceptual art, paving path, being internationally successful. And, having Walter and Maria coming and visiting them in Slovenia and spending time schooling together. And instead of pursuing this wonderful career, they just decide to drop out and move out of, not only of the city, but really move out of the art world and start to live according to their own beliefs. There were obviously counterculture, hippie, and so on, different movements within one thing. But, this is an example of actually practicing survivalism, of this highly educated artist who suddenly moved out into the abandoned house and started to live from what they could find around. And they were doing up their own house. They used only the tools that they produced themselves. They grew their own food. They used only remedies they could do themselves. They had no electricity. They had bee wax from which they made candles. Sometimes they would exchange something with the farmers, and this is the way they went. This is how they lived, but in a way it was a little bit helped by the fact that one of the members of the group came from more scientific background, had a degree in chemistry, and it was more practical about surviving on the land. So he helped a bit in the beginning. For some people, this lasted 1 year, and they had to go to India. But for other people, they stayed, and Marko Pogacnik is still there. To this day, yeah.
And so now moving on to another example, which gives a different approach again, and maybe a more located more on the person and less a kind of group activity, is Peter Stembere, an artist also working in normalization era Czechoslovakia, who turned to his own body as a site for theoretical and practical explorations of how to go beyond the limits of the political reality of the time. And although a whole stream of his performances, which art critics have maybe tended to concentrate, were concerned with testing the limits of the human body, such as in the ultimately anthropocentrically sounding series Narcissus. Stembere also undertook a series of highly radical performances that problematized the idea of alienation from a non-anthropocentric point of view. And it's quite interesting that for Chakrabarty, we humans never experience ourselves as a species. We can only intellectually comprehend or infer the existence of the human species, but never experience it as such. And in fact, Stembere's practice tantalizingly maybe tests the boundaries of the impossibility of this experience by somehow reaching over the barriers between species, between human and non-human animals, and even raising the possibility of also connecting, going over the boundary to plants in this extremely radical action when he grafted a tree sapling into his arm, which and it stayed there until it caused some horrible infection, in fact. So, I mean, he was, in a way, showing the impossibility of it, but also the desire to try and go over these boundaries.
Okay, and if you think about him as an example of how artists navigate the art world and art mechanisms both in the East and the West, he was one of the most avid networkers between and communicators between the East or between the Prague artists and the artists abroad. And he was inviting people. People came to Marina, other people came to visit him, but he could never go out. He was very based in his locality. Only once he traveled to America on the invitation of Chris Buden. But when he could participate, he sent his work by post and the works of his colleagues by post absolutely everywhere around the world. He could be in Japan, in exhibitions in South America. In North America, he was just taking parts in the conceptual art exhibitions around the world without ever being present there. And then suddenly in 1980, I don't think it was sudden, but in 1980 he wrote a letter to all these galleries saying that from now on he's not going to take part in these exhibitions where you just send your work and you never get it back, and it's just artists, these curators just asking to take part in this kind of curated show. So this was like a critique of curating from the point of view of an artist who could never really benefit from the art market because he was completely cut out, but he really saw no sense of taking more of these kind of participations in absence, and really said, please, this is not, in PS, he was also like, please, this is not work of art, please don't exhibit this letter. And, never ever again, he abandoned art practice together with his colleagues. It was collective action because all three friends and colleagues abandoned it at the same time, and he never returned to it.
And the third and final example of new avant-garde practice we want to just bring in is that of Slovak artist Rudolf Sikora, who we think just looking at this work and other works he's done from that period is really interesting in terms of current debates around the implications of the Anthropocene, because his practice from the early 70s was very much about science and integrating ecological thinking and scientific thought into conceptual art, and also placing history within these wider spatial and temporal contexts and schemes that we've been hearing about. So this work, Earth Should Not Become a Dead Planet, from 72, has these. You can see also both the kind of going up to the ozone and to the climate, and also below the sort of geographical layers below. So he was really, I think, quite early in thinking through the implications of the geological layers, and in a way integrating this view of environmental history with also human history. And it's interesting that the last picture shows an atomic bomb going off, which also, for many theorists, has also symbolized the really the moment of the beginning of the Anthropocene, somehow symbolizing humans starting to really interfere in the planet, the mechanisms of the planet, and also the geological structures of the planet to such a scale that we're in a different geological age.
So for Sikora, it's interesting that he was very much interested in the scientific and the he had this interest in ecology as ideas and science and concept, and he got to these ideas through the samizdat about limits to growth. And so he was really referring to the studies of the limits to growth in that time in Eastern Europe, and through him these ideas also came into the art history of the region, especially of Slovakia. So we do have like a whole environmental history is already built into art history at the time of the 1970s. In terms of his career is tedious, it's continuous, but it's also very modest. And only he graduated in 69, managed to have only one show, and then for 20 years he couldn't exhibit at all in Bratislava, Slovakia, or in Czechoslovakia, and had to wait till the end of the Cold War to be able to exhibit again and take a position in the art academy.
Okay, and now we'd like to talk about just one contemporary example, and this is really Tomasz Kossasz, also working as the Ex-Artists Collective, and in his work, we think you can really feel on the one hand the influence of this legacy of the neo-avant-garde's dematerialized and quite sustainable and kind of group practices from the 60s and 70s, but also he's very much directly concerned with issues of survival, against the backdrop of ecological crisis, and he also very much doesn't think about crisis, but this idea of collapse. Also, from the point of view of institutions, maybe it's interesting to mention straight away that he, in a way, the Ex-Artists Collective, and the name Ex-Artists Collective, reverses this the general kind of pattern or assumption under neoliberalism that maybe artists should do a mundane job in order to have the time and the money to actually be an artist in their spare time, in their free time. They completely reverse it. So their aim is to use the art world, use the institutional art world to accumulate as much money and goods as they can, so that they will be able to leave the institutional art world and stop doing art in galleries, or as they say, to afford an art practice without institutional mediation. And while at the moment they're living in this kind of parallel world of institutional and non-institutional until they have enough goods to be able to give up the art career. So it's quite funny.
So they work, they always recycle the works and upcycle them and add new meanings to them or reuse them. And this was very exemplified, this Pangaea work, where meaning of the work, the title is like the all earth. That's the meaning of the word, and it really goes 200,000 million years ago when the earth was just one continent, and it means all earth, and this is where we all the same. And I think this is interesting from the point of view of climate change. When in the media we always see just the images of the poor being affected with the climate change, and never understanding, never really wanting to bring the message that it affects us all equally. It's interesting in their practice they look back to the figure of the agricultural worker, not the worker in the social system, but the agricultural worker as the potential for the revolutionary change. And they also refer to all these peasant uprisings and revolutions in the history that helped to change situations before. And they also practice permaculture, really work on survivalist skills themselves, and kind of try to imagine what will happen after oil runs out. And this is their collapsism ideas of, on the one hand, if you're not prepared, if you not practice survivalism, you will end up as a slave. On the other hand, if you're prepared, you might, and especially if you rely on the folk science, they see that there might be a chance to form new society. And
also, can see in his or in their work, it's very much again about, we had mentioned before about withdrawal and exit. They're more on that line rather than on the political activist line. And it's also, you can see it in their lifestyle. So they also move to an island outside Budapest in the Danube, where they have the conditions for this slower lifestyle, for doing permaculture gardening. And also maybe just to mention one more thing which is important maybe for this idea of other survivalisms. Kossasz has stated that in order to survive, it's not enough to learn some hunter's tricks, but the forest poetry has to be studied as well. So, and again, if we think of survival, it's not just about going in and like hacking into nature, trying to survive in nature, but somehow being more in tune with the natural world. And this is interesting from their point of view about, we heard yesterday that withdrawal is not an option, and it's certainly not an option in London. And when a few years ago there were a lot of debates about post-Fordism and exit, Paul Virna's exit, and there was no way the exit would be a solution in London. But what we want to point out, and maybe in some other locations, in some other situations, the exit is an option, and our people did try to withdraw and to find solutions in that way. And another thing that his work is very interesting is that they really do have the idea that we should not work, and that we have to learn not to work. And then in one of their artist books, there is also a figure sitting on top of the green hill, and there's a text with it. What are you doing? Nothing. Great. Teach me how to do it.
teaching to having to learn not to work. And yesterday we heard about the overwork of people in the art world, and we all, I think, overworked in some ways. But at the same time, this is connected to the overproduction, and we all overproduce as well. And then we come to this new, forthcoming notion of the degrowth. And in his work, it's already very much addressed some of these things.
Okay, and just in this last section of our introduction, we'd just like to take the chance to maybe reflect a little on how these issues are also come out in our own curatorial practice, and in particular in this current programme we're working on, the River School. This has grown out of a kind of longer-term engagement we've had with issues of sustainability in contemporary art. Here you can see some of the, in fact, all the symposia that we organised at Central European University in Budapest since 2006, which we won't go into at all now. But we just wanted to say that in the last year we've somehow shifted from looking at particular issues that seem key to questions of art and ecology to focusing on the river as a kind of constituent part of the natural environment. Maybe this kind of reframing or refocusing is an attempt on our part to maybe try and take a less anthropocentric approach to sustainability. The River School that we showed a little film of our recent trip. It looks at environmental histories of the region, including environmental art histories, which we think are really important, such as moments when the river became an issue for protest and the growth of civil rights movements in the 1980s in Hungary, also in Slovakia, as well as the question of the changing relationship of people to the river in both cities and in rural areas, and also to this question of the liberation of energy, which is the subject of the forthcoming symposium we're doing in October in Budapest. How can we liberate energy at the moment of this great clash between renewables and new nuclear, which is really being played out in Hungary, where they've just signed a really horrible agreement with Putin to build 2 more nuclear reactors, which are also along the Danube in Paks. So it's a kind of context of that. And
another part of the project was an exhibition which is called Like a Bird, and this was the first time we created an exhibition on from the interspecies dialogue, or we actually created the exhibition about the birds. But the title comes from this work from 1972, and it's a Hungarian artist István Haraszti, and he had this cage with the bird in it, and as soon as the bird wanted to fly out through the open doors, the doors were shut as soon as he left the twig there.
So he left the twig to go out and the doors shut.
So he had to stay in prison. And this was very much interpreted as the situation for Hungary during communism, the question of freedom that artists were so interested in. And we wanted to ask the question, can we think about the species? Can we think about, did this metaphor migrate nowadays from this bird always symbolizes some kind of freedom? Do we have some other ideas about what the meaning of this species could be, and
or do we have something in
whether
common?
We share again something common, not imprisonment, but maybe some kind of precarious situation that we're all facing in this time. And this is an extremely difficult thing to do in Hungary at the moment. And that's why we work in Don Quixote style, because it's really, really hard to find a space to debate the issues around ecology when the issues of freedom are so urgent. And this is one of the leading Hungarian artists, Kispál Szabolcs, protesting on the streets against this new institution that was established by the new government, which has taken over the whole of the art world and the whole of the funding of the art world.
And there's no exaggeration.
And so this is another leading Hungarian artist, Nemes Csaba, who worked very peacefully, or for a very, very long time, till he could not take it any longer. And there he is in the meeting of the MMA, protesting and shouting and being smashed with the constitution.
I think it may have been a book of poetry.
What is MMA?
That's the Hungarian Artistic Academy.
Yeah,
Maja
MMA.
Academy, which is set up as a kind of, it's a whole other debate. Maybe we don't really want to go into that right at this second, but maybe we can also in the discussion go into that more. But it's also interesting from the point of view of this, there was this heroic moment where Csaba Nemes was hit on the head by this aging right-wing conservative poet with his poems, and that went round on Facebook and on the news. And then, like the next day, one of his students, an artist, made a drawing of it, kind of immortalised this moment, which is, we think, it's quite funny. Yeah. But how can you talk about ecology and birds and species when everyone is so worried about the everyday of politics, which is a kind of East European condition, but maybe especially heightened in Hungary right now? And just at the end, we just want to share with you just one, in the spirit of a public editorial meeting. We just came back from the Delta. In fact, earlier this month, we had the River School in Romania, and this is just like a little tiny excerpt of a recording that we made, a kind of late night conversation about some of these issues. Just a 30-second clip, just to give you a feeling of maybe also what we have in mind or what we want to explore more with this river school.
A little bit about the form or the idea of a river school, or this idea that we have that could be interesting to take discussions. We've had loads of discussions that have referenced all kinds of theories and literature and things that are going on currently in the art world. What happens when you take those ideas and those discussions and you have them in a setting like this with the concert of frogs in the background? And what does that do to those ideas? Do they change when they meet this more natural situation?
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will conclude this panel with the presentation by Marina. Marina, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Boris, and it was incredibly interesting and inspiring to hear these two presentations, and the ones yesterday. Thank you, Maria, for inviting me. I mean, it's also interesting to be on this panel because I don't normally work on ecology. But at the moment, I'm kind of seem to be heading towards those questions because I'm being invited to talk about them in different in different kinds of thematic constellations. So it's very compelling for me to try and do that as well, and to enter into a dialogue with people who do work on it. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And apart from the topic of ecology, I'm also coming to the former West project quite fresh, not having been previously involved in any of its public or published iterations. Of course, I've been aware of it and have thought through a few of its questions in other contexts. So in light of this, perhaps I can kind of start maybe with a bit of mind mapping, or replicate my own process of mind mapping. With some of the associations that the name Former West brought to mind in light of the challenges to survival at different scales that we are both dealing with in our respective practices and contexts and within the focus of this editorial meeting. So first of all, strangely, because it never happened before, but now when I was preparing this presentation, the name Former West evoked for me, and maybe I'm not alone in this, Oswald Spengler's controversial and very influential early 1920s book, The Decline of the West, or Der Untergang des Abendlands in the original German. So here, and this was kind of quite discussed and fetishized book, and very ideologically problematic book in the first part of the century, 20th century. So here, the principal gesture of this, of his project, of Spengler's project, and maybe also of the reference, or one of the references within the term Former West, is a spatialization of history. For him, history was spatialized in a cultural and civilizational region called the West. And now, both for him and for us, very differently, the spatialization is also meant to orient ourselves in what may be a moment of passing of the centrality of this region as a locus of historical progress. For Spengler, this was the case. This decline, this passing of the West as a progressive region was caused by the rise of the inferior races and also the inferior classes in the metropolis itself, seized as they had become by collectivist manias, such as socialism. So here, what might be interesting for us to discuss is the significance of the gesture of spatializing history, identifying a region with a historical moment, which can then be positioned as an anchor for pre and especially post moments, and that's going to be, I guess, the topic of the next panel. In Spengler's case, this is done in order to lament the decline of the inexorable development of global enlightenment and progress, largely achieved through bourgeois individualism, Christianity, and market exchange, and the imperialism that spread these developmental virtues over the globe. In the case of the former West, it is rather a gesture to mark the limits of a West given over increasingly to parochialism and irrelevance after the end of the Cold War and the demise of identifiable geopolitical blocs, standing in for different values and visions of social organization. Or, and maybe at the same time, a question about whether neoliberal globalization has made such regional designations redundant, certainly in the sense of standing for some set of ideals or principles, or has rather simply expanded the West over the whole world. There is thus a tension between provincialism and universality that the concept of the West as being or becoming former makes visible. Of course, geopolitically, we can see that the West against the rest is very much alive and well in certain registers, given the global conflicts of the moment in Ukraine, or any of the numerous wars or ongoing policing operations undertaken by the US and its allies in the Middle East. So what does it mean, ultimately, to spatialize history, or rather to spatialize a crisis? Spatialization impacts very much how we think of ecology, for example. One of the foremost principles that have emerged in eco-criticism and environmental politics more broadly has been the unpredictable and systemic nature of climate change. Species extinction in one place might trigger crop failure over a whole region. Resource exhaustion is a chaotic multiplier, as is degrees of warming of the oceans, etc. This kind of crisis cannot be spatialized because it exists simultaneously, erratically, and also in timescales beyond human lifespans or political or structures of governance, political governance. Even if there were mobilizations of such forced political action to mitigate or reverse any of these effects, if it was still possible, would be a more realistic expectation than it is at present. So here we have the relationship of scale, or thinking about scale, when thinking about crisis as an ecological phenomenon or force. As Andrew Fisher has written, on these bases, one might ask whether the promise of measure, proportion, and resolution held out by the ability to ascertain the scale of things now finds itself deranged. While thinking about geopolitical processes in terms of their scales may be familiar from decades of research on political geography, arguably new de- and rescaled realities have emerged to put into question the understanding of political territories and social processes that might be offered by such existing methodologies. End of quote. At the same time, an ecological perspective, while imbuing us with awareness of the sheer ungraspability and resistance of environmental disaster and decline to local or technological solutions, can also become obfuscating when translated into social and political discourses. The complicity between, for example, systems theory and market fundamentalism or libertarianism is perhaps already a well-worn trope of critique, but it is also perhaps one of the best-known examples of how social metaphors are projected onto something called nature, then re-imported back into the social, as a narrative legitimating entrenched injustice and hierarchy as simply the natural order of things. And I suppose some of those debates were behind how we can reinvent or rethink nature as a subject. So I mentioned systems theory or complexity theory here, but one could equally point to social Darwinism and the naturalization of blind competition as it underlies many of these approaches, the correlations between the market and nature. Thus, ecological thinking, when pursued in the realm of the social, and again, maybe this is a banal point, and we'd have to, of course, discuss how and in what sense nature and society can be separated, as well as what ideological work concepts like the Anthropocene are doing. So this ecological thinking pursued in the realm of the social can occlude the conflicts of interest, the structural inequality, in other words, the contradictions that structure our reality and its crisis alike. So crisis for whom, in other words? So one side note here could be made that if we think of a West in decline, or being displaced from a historical centrality as an idea into a formerness, and perhaps also a formlessness, we would also need to remember in what sense the West as an ideal and as a geopolitical entity first emerged as a result of subjugation of the indigenous people and the exploitation of their labor, as well as wholesale colonial massacres, which is, of course, a fact which is programmatically repressed in EU and North American immigration policy, for example, as well as the ecological policy making we've been hearing about. The upshot of this is the West can only become former because it needed the rest of the world to fade into darkness to emerge as that shining city on a hill, economically and culturally and ideologically. And we're interested in what it might mean to talk about its formerness, inasmuch as this opens up a discussion of how the East and the South are also becoming former, whereas before they could not be said to decline, certainly in the time of Spengler, because they were already in a perpetual state of emergency due to colonial domination. And here I speak of the global South, as it were. The situation of the so-called East is obviously very specific and divergent from this. So these thoughts are effectively circling around what it would mean in the current moment to frame a propositional as well as a critical approach to a global crisis. Such an approach would have to be one which would both take into account the utility of crisis for inducing states of panic or accommodation in the powerless, or an identification with power, which means the ruthless short-term accumulation and exploitation we witness around us intensifying and accelerating ever more sharply in the pools of concentrated power and resources. It's being able to ask the question of crisis for whom and for what, in spite of the present and because of the present, where we all live in the same world, a world subject to sharp geosystemic decline, but also a world in which we do not really have a propositional basis to organize or mobilize against a further decline of our conditions of social and human reproduction, or rather its aggregation into fewer and fewer hands. So in contrast to some of the ideas that have been enunciated perhaps in some of the programmatic text of the former West, or perhaps in what Catherine Gibson was saying earlier, in contrast to this, I would say we cannot pretend that we are all in this together, of course. And this has already been criticized thoroughly yesterday in the kind of participation economy and big society, or participation society discussion. Crisis is a very selective phenomenon, both relatively and absolutely, and what is in crisis, supposedly a way of life and an economic system that guaranteed it, is also constituted by crisis and profits from crisis, aka creative destruction and disruptive innovation. And it has lived off the crisis much of the world has been sustaining for decades, if not centuries. Even when it seems to come closer to the old homelands of the West, which are themselves class societies which have habitually reproduced poverty and misery for large segments of their populations, as it has since the 2007-2008 financial crisis, it is still very selective, and common interests, again, departing simply from an understanding of crisis as a systemic phenomenon that hits all equally, rather than from a propositional critique, common interests are far from evident, whether between professional arenas, economic and cultural strata, classes, or institutions at different scales. So here I was a little bit interested in unpacking some of the notions of critique that were mentioned in some parts and perhaps opened up and kind of complexified in other parts of the former West essay. the essay which is on the website for this event, rather. So I was mostly interested in Rosie Braidotti's position, where she writes, thinking and acting in spite of the times, not in a belligerent mode of oppositional consciousness, but as a humble and empowering gesture of co-construction of sustainable futures. And there's obviously, I think, very promising elements to that kind of perspective, but also problematic elements. So in one sense, we could maybe take a kind of slightly cynical view and say avoiding an oppositional consciousness can be very convenient. It can mean skating over the questions of unequal and structurally exploitative power relation and embracing a bourgeois consensus, which it is always the default of social democratic cultural institutions, including academia, to fall back on in times of crisis, as Maria was discussing yesterday, which can also end up articulating value in economic terms when that previous cultural consensus appears to be defunct in a given political situation, as it is here. It also means never having to address how the performer of the humble and empowering gesture intends to ensure it remains a gesture and does not examine their own structural implication in and benefiting from the field of that which has to be overcome or undermined in order for this co-construction to be effective, to really begin. In this respect, I'd like to echo what Andrea, Simon, and Jonas, in their different ways, were all saying about the politics of institutions. Institutions have to consider their political engagement starting from the relations of force and finance they are both subject to and which circulates in and through them. It is from this basis that resources can be shared and multiplied across scales of institutions, organizations, and other collectivities and individuals, and demands can be made in a wider social field. On the other hand, I would like to maybe follow this idea of the bankruptcy of certain models of oppositional critique, perhaps in the sense that critique, particularly in art discourse and academia, and perhaps stretching beyond that, has attained a sort of default or hegemonic posture, a sheerly normative and, in fact, reproductive status in these fields of discourse, or rather, that's been the case for some time. So we should be questioning the nature and the purpose of critique and the position of critique. But perhaps not from a perspective of maintenance of existing arrangements and power relations which it already serves, which assumes a sort of preemptive exclusion of opposition. The oppositional and propositional moments of critique as a disposition activity, I don't think can be separated. They're not optional, they're not components. Just like the activity of critique and its conditions of possibility cannot be separated. So this would in fact be a definition of immanent critique, which is what you would get in very different ways in a reference which is maybe closer to Braidotti, which is Deleuze, but maybe a reference which is further Marx, and most of the materialist philosophical trajectory. We could also think about how ecological crisis, that is a crisis in the conditions which allow us to generate a critique theoretically or practically, also acts as a sort of recursive obstacle to critique. The self-reflexivity of critique as a modern philosophical project is thrown into epistemic crisis by the paradoxes that a global crisis, a crisis on a global scale, poses to it, meaning we need to take a more speculative approach to this fundamentally recursive crisis. That is, a crisis that rapidly bounces back and erodes the conditions for its identification and critique. So just a quick quote from a book I was reading on the plane, which is Adorno's Hegel, 3 Studies. And in the introduction, the translator, Sherry Vidden-Nicholson, writes, dialectical thinking has to shape itself to the contours of the object, not as an irreducible given, but as something with its own tensions and contradictions, which include those of the thought that tries to comprehend it. So this is also an idea of critique as not just immanent to a field of operation, but also recursive. It's also always encountering the conditions of its articulation. And my second sort of vocabulary exercise is maybe the idea of survival. So in a way, I think maybe this is a question we could also raise about survival as a desirable objective for us. So in a way, if we counterpose survival as a concept and a field of implication to life, so like in the phrase, not living but surviving, which is kind of what you don't want to hear from someone when you ask how they're doing. So do we want to live or survive, I guess? And then I was also thinking of survivalism, the term survivalism as a kind of survival of something from another, an untimely kind of survival of something that would seem to have been extinct or obsolete as it comes back in another era. So then what is out of time and untimely in thinking about survivalism? Is the art institution itself a kind of survivalism? And then sort of excavating further how this term survival is operating in our field of inquiry. There's something also quite sort of static about it, the idea, in a way, life without a horizon of change or intensification could just be said to be survival. So survival is a very minimal concept, just sort of a maintenance of the current minimal conditions of reproduction. And is surviving what we are doing in the present anyway. The acceptance of destruction is an outcome of the ethos of survivalism. Survival is always survival under crisis conditions. That seems to be part of its basic definition. So survival then denotes the outliving, the overliving of a destructive event, but it says nothing about the meaning or quality of that life in the aftermath of its being almost destroyed. So apart from these rather general reflections, and moving towards a conclusion, there is much that could be added to refine our focus, particularly our focus, I don't mean our general focus, but maybe going back to the thinking about ecology and eco-criticism. For instance, the logic of sacrifice, maybe this reflects more on survival or survivalism. The logic of sacrifice, entwined as it is with a fatalistic certainty in the inevitability of technological progress. This is one way we can analyze the ideology of debt and the spiritual appeal of austerity, the production of indebted subjectivities, as I've written about elsewhere, as sacrifice, with the logic of resigning ourselves to loss of species, loss of habitats, and indeed whole parts of the inhabited world. I mean, something I've been sort of quite confounded by since a visit to Los Angeles a few months ago, and also reading about the sort of ecological situation there. It seems to kind of be an open secret, certainly for the people who live in the American Southwest, that the most heavily populated and industrialized parts of the Southwest in the US are going to succumb to drought in the next few decades. And radical adjustments are going to be made to that society, as well as the extremely radical adjustments that have been made to its ecological structures. Or that fracking is likewise making large areas of the West and the Southwest of the United States increasingly polluted and geologically unstable. But the overall assumption, or the overall sort of horizon, seems to be one of helplessness. So this is maybe another iteration of the former West, now the final frontier of ecological meltdown, a former Earth maybe. So before moving to a few points on the role of space on the role or the space of cultural production in this constellation, it might also be helpful, at least certainly for my understanding, I think, to open up a discussion of the deployment of the term post-capitalism in the discussion, a term which I would say brings a number of challenging but also problematic assumptions in its wake. So I guess I would be curious for all of us to think about, talk about, is post-capitalism a state that we are already in somehow, or a state towards which we are moving? if we're already in post-capitalism, I mean, it seems a bit stretching plausibility to assert that we no longer live in a world where people are separated from their means of production and reproduction, a world where all social relationships are ultimately, if not imminently, mediated by the power of money, and abstract labor and value production continue to be the parameters of how most people survive, whether or not they are paid, alluding to the first presentation of the day. If the latter, i.e. if we are moving towards post-capitalism, then we would certainly need to talk about how to get there, and whether the transition is envisioned as gradual and peaceful, a certain sort of spreading of commoning, or messy and destructive, as we are seeing now. In essence, the term seems to beg the question of what definition of capitalism we are working with. The first thing we would have to come to terms with is that, unfortunately perhaps, it is a totalizing system, a global system, a system which must expand to survive and which does not necessarily imply or require our survival. This seems redundant to say in the present moment, given the history of the West and the South and the East wrestling with and failing to manage precisely this condition. Yet it seems to me that there are a number of misapprehensions, motivated to various degrees, circulating about just how optional or how dominant capitalism is in our current reality. Certainly, for example, in the discussion about the commons that we heard yesterday, it's very important not to start out from the premise that capital and the state are all powerful and that no other forms of social relations or legal structures, actually, and property relations that those legal structures imply are possible. I would be totally opposed to a kind of monster of capitalism vision in that respect. On the other hand, we should have reservations about reading capitalism along any of its empirical and historical manifestations without reckoning with its structural features in their interplay with the state and with politics. We might be living post, so to speak, and this category is obviously very prismatically interrogated as part of the agenda of the former West, the project of the former West is very concerned about this implications of the post. So we might be living post, so to speak, a particular historical instance of capitalism in the West, hence the analogy with its formerness. I would definitely not say we're living in post-capitalism per se. So, however, it seems indisputable that the sphere of culture, or more specifically art, and it would be important to spell out the basis for the distinction if it's not simply an institutional or economic one, and hence, if it is only institutional and economic, it can also be non-conflictual or ecological. The sphere of culture, more specifically art, does have very specific capacities and affordances, to use an ecological vocabulary, in making crisis visible and palpable, as we saw in the two previous presentations, and arguing for its autonomy as a model for an emancipated future. And here I would like to recall the words of art historian Bryony Fair at a conference last weekend, which TJ was present at as well, where she spoke about, quote, the insistence on something unyielding and unassimilable in art, which is a response to what it means to make art under conditions of systemic collapse, end quote. So this idea, to me, seems to recall a double or dialectical, as you will, notion of ecology as both the index of a crisis which is actually unassimilable and unyielding to our attempts to fold it into the reproduction of the same, its moment of rupture, the recognition of the conditions of systemic collapse, and, on the other side, its side of maintenance, the side of maintenance that comes with this notion of ecology, of perpetuating the illusion that the scale is such as to encompass us all equally, to be equally urgent for an undifferentiated humanity insofar as we are alive. That is, the crisis is assimilated, domesticated to a we. But this we does not exist. So long as life is a commodity, survival will have a differentiated market. Thus, ecological thought tends to slide into as I guess I missed this discussion, but there are references to it yesterday, a sort of religious form of thinking. And if we are thinking about actor network theory, it only remains to add that Bruno Latour is a fervent Catholic. Actor network theory can thus lead to certain configurations of thought and analysis which are fundamentally passive, because it slides over and absorbs all contradictions which could produce dynamism or movement in its world of networks. So this is one side of ecological thinking, at least, but not the side I've been trying to point out, its recursive, troubling, critical, paradoxical side. And concluding now, Bryony Fair's description of art as a kind of subjective, or maybe trans-individual, site within and against systemic collapse brings to mind as well Theodor Adorno's notion of mimesis as a double-edged dynamic of warding off and succumbing to an all-devouring world through play or through art. Mimesis here acting as a way of emulating the object, for example, nature, and the society naturalized into an object is the arena of identification, that is, subsuming everything to a concept, which mimesis hopefully tries to break, this conceptuality. Mimesis runs the risk of blind and asocial ritual, identification with technocratic tyranny. In this sense, we can also think of mimesis as a patropaic, that is, a fetish to ward off a menacing object by sort of assimilating and neutralizing it at the level of discourse or the imagination, perhaps. And maybe it is in this sense we can think about post-capitalism, or the idea the economy is what we do with it, not what it does to us. This is in a way a patropaic gesture, warding off the horror of thinking about capital as a totalizing system through the magic of non-totalizing categories. If we don't use a totalizing language, the bad totality won't come and get us, or our own contradictions for that matter. This could also be seen as a mimesis of the foreclosures of totality, insofar as this is a banned category in dominant thinking, insofar as this constitutes one of the depoliticizing, future-proofing strategies of neoliberalism, as has been extensively discussed yesterday. Yet mimesis is the rational or cognitive content of art, its need to assimilate and transfigure the world, and this impulse itself may not be assimilable, as Fair was describing. It emulates nature, but a nature which is not yet actual. The mimesis performed by art is an imitation of what does not yet exist. This is something like a propositional content, though its departure point is a negative one. Here it only remains to be added that art must at once be understood in this way, and the sphere of action of art institutions likewise, as well as a conduit for solidarity with other and differently positioned actors, while not letting its constitutive flexibility and formlessness provide an alibi for the state or for the public to allow other kinds of institutions to be dismantled. This is why I think we have to argue for a politics of solidarity and partisanship for the institution, which is incompatible with any notion, however philosophically refined, of we are all in this together. Survival, in other words, but on what terms? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Marina. You have actually summed up. Not only summed up the discussions from yesterday, but also announced the next panel. Yes. So you could replace me here. Yep. But since we don't have so much time for the discussion, and since it has been so many interesting problems raised in the presentations, I'm inviting you directly to take part in these decisions with comments and questions. So I'll rather restrain of my questions. So please.
This is a question for TJ, and I was very interested in the context of Former West to unpack a little bit your negative vision of neo-developmentalism, because especially of the BRIC countries, because it seems to me that it's in a way it's the only form of state economy that has survived capitalism. So there is really a phobia especially from America, against the neo-developmentalism of China, Brazil. And that's because it's got a strong state at the center. And often this phobia about the neo-developmentalism is kind of covered through ecological issue. So trade boycotts and all sorts of protectionism are justified through the fact that China is polluting more than any other country in the world. The second point that follows from that is your discussion of indigeneism, and which in a way to me really shows how notions of kind of the market view of nature and the kind of pure view of nature, as well of the other, are always kind of connected to each other. And the debate about indigeneity is problematic in India, because in the 1970s, when all the kind of subaltern movement came out and the farmers movement came out, it was completely co-opted by the high caste male elite. And the problem of neo-developmentalism in India arises precisely from that kind of co-optation of the rural elite, of that kind of movements that was very strong. Whereas in Brazil, another neo-developmental country, indigeneity was not an issue, and yet indigenous rights were very strong in the Constitution, Democratic Constitution 1988, together with women's rights, black rights, and all sorts of constellation rights that came out from the social movement of the 80s. So to me, there is a problem in kind of replicating these terms, especially in a cosmopolitan art context. And if you talk about indigeneism in Brazil, really they say that you are a colonialist, because no academic, no politically engaged social movement believe in indigeneism anymore. And also, these debates ricochet back in the sense that the Movimento do Sem Terra, the landless movement in Brazil, was used as a model by far-right farmers movement in France, for instance. So my question is, what does it mean really, indigeneism, for you? Does it mean that we are all sort of animist, as Anselm Frank, I think, sort of curating logic assume? Or does it mean that we have to take a kind of perspective of subsistence economy perspective, as von Mises or even Gibson would say? And how do you institute that in this context? For instance, combining a form of market economy or non-market economy, how do you achieve that? And last, in terms of cultural production, I think that Amar Kanwa films are actually really an expression of that kind of duplicity and contradiction of neo-developmental places like India, where they combine activism and art in a really specific way, which also I think Brazilian visual art does in the same way. So I think it's really important also to relate models of development with models of cultural production or of visual art, which are not familiar to us.
Okay, thanks for that. That was a pretty complex set of questions. So I'm really, we need to have a discussion outside of this to open all those things up. So I'll try to address some of them quickly. First, developmentalism. For me, one of the of course, the kind of critique of developmentalism in BRIC countries, for me, is separate from the kind of mainstream governmental politics coming from the US and Europe that would resist entering into like ecological agreements because of perceived inequality in relationship to the status of sacrifice and national development between the West and those other countries. That's a very complicated matter, but I'm increasingly drawn to critiques of the idea that countries like India and Brazil should be allowed to develop and should be given an ecological pass, as it were, in order to develop. And as certain activists are articulating this criticism, I think that's true, and the danger is to allow countries to mimic a form of developmentalism, as we're seeing in India today, that continues, as well as Brazil, that continues in the most destructive patterns, and also is not about a social movement of extending and embracing forms of social justice and equality, but rather to increase forms of economic inequality between classes. So you're seeing that tremendous divide only growing in countries like India. So the idea of an ecological past to allow a social justice movement of developmentalism is no longer, I think, viable. There's, I think, much more to be said in terms of your question, but indigeneity, sure, this is a very dense and conflictual in some ways and complex term that has had different articulations over the decades and even longer. But as a term, it's not so. It doesn't have such a long history. But for me, I'm interested in following the kinds of articulations of indigeneity that I was mentioning, like from people like Vandana Shiva and formations of international movements around this term that I think are inspire that politics of solidarity that I think Marina was talking about, like the Cochabamba movement for the rights of Mother Earth. I think these are really important developments within the practice of indigeneity that position it as, like I was trying to argue, a really crucial resource in relationship to survivability, social justice, forms of economic and community-based equality, and ecological sustainability in relationship to things like providing models for degrowth, for relocalization, for deglobalization, for reconceptualizing the term development, for modes of solidarity and transnational social movements. I don't want to obviously homogenize the term at all, but I think there are tremendous resources within the current formations around indigeneity that are incredibly important. And if we're to talk about how to get beyond the kind of destructive eco-catastrophe that we find ourselves in, that has to be an area that we turn to as a resource. Not the only one, but a really significant one. Now, in terms of Amar Kanwar's work, there may be problems with his practice. I was really trying to focus on one area that I find really interesting, because for me, as someone who's always grown up within an urban academic intellectual environment, that's my formation in a way, I think it's really interesting to look for models of how we can find these kind of hybrid moments of solidarity between an urban academic intellectual cultural practice on the one hand and forms of indigenous agroecology and social movements and the kind of indigenous rights that we find in places like Orissa in East India. For me, Amar's work is really a very interesting proposal for how we can begin to think about like the range of subjective becoming that would put us in a new relation to indigeneity, where it's not at all what Anselm Franca is talking about in terms of animism, but rather something altogether different, which is much more of a political project of solidarity and movement building, and seeing indigenous practices as a resource for how to live differently and live within the world, in which case, in one way or another, we are all indigenous. Again, as Jim Clifford argues. I think that that's a really complex and difficult but extremely important proposition. I'm not able to present the complexity of that right now, but I think it's one that we really is very much worth thinking about further.
Thank you. Janas.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to ask a different question, but I want to tap into this discussion on indigeneity, because I would want to bring forward also Tim Ingold as a thinker, anthropologist Tim Ingold, because I totally agree that you cannot equate animism and indigeneity because it are really different things. And Tim Ingold actually had, I don't recall the title of the article, but he says the opposite thing. He's making a case for us, like capitalist Western people, being the animists actually, and not the indigenous people. So that's an interesting way of looking at it in a different way. I had another question to T.G. Demos on Vandana Shiva, as he is of course also a theoretical person who very much engenders the discussion, coming from a feminist position, and I just wonder how you work that through in your analysis and perhaps your book also. Thank you.
Thank you. In addition to Tom Ingold, I would add Isabel Stengers for a reading of what she calls capitalist sorcery. Right, that's very interesting and productive for thinking about how animism exists within advanced global neoliberalism. For sure, I think that's really significant. Vandana Shiva is she's a very important figure for me in terms of how to think political ecology in relationship to the post-colonial condition, again drawing on indigeneity and also discussions of Mother Earth and how to integrate. Or how to begin to think about integrating modes of ritual or traditional practices around spirituality in relationship to nature in a critical practice. I think I've always been quite allergic to these terms as someone trained very much in a kind of Marxist materialism. But I think it's increasingly important to try to meet the challenge of what this proposition of becoming indigenous might mean by thinking about those exact types of practices. I think it's really crucial to look at, and this comes up through cultural practices like Amar's, where we have the possibility to talk about this conflict between a mining company like Vedanta seeing the Niamgiri Hills in Orissa as a source of financial profit through bauxite mining. In contrast to the Dongria Khond indigenous people who see that same mountain as a location of the divine. That's a fascinating epistemological, cosmological, economic, social, political conflict that's incredibly complicated. But I think this is an amazing opportunity to talk about this type of conflict, which is so meaningful for how we choose to live today and survive.
Jonas. Jonas.
Yes. My first question is for Marina Vishmidt on your proposition of a former Earth in relationship to the notion of the concept of critique. So I was wondering, what do you consider the moment in survival that truly changes the meaning of the word critique? When the word critique or the concept of critique or the practice of critique as we know it is no longer viable? Because I think that from what you were saying, I understand that critique is also something that exists in relationship to crisis, which is something different than extinction. In the sense of, if we make it incredibly banal, and the ecological catastrophe that now exists mainly on a kind of discursive level on the stage, but it becomes a meteorite that wipes out Earth in the coming week, then what does that change fundamentally? If we understand the fundamental threats that we're facing, actually understand them, how does that translate to practice in relationship to a concept of critique? Can critique survive in the former Earth, so to say? The concept and practice of it as such. And my question to teacher Demos on the notion of becoming, your proposition of becoming indigenous, or the idea of indigeneity as survival, apart from the obvious risk of exoticism that I think is part of this discourse and that you have also critiqued in the past, so I presume that you know the kind of pitfalls in that proposition. I'm also wondering how this relates to the project of internationalism, in the sense that the idea that indigeneity in itself is threatened by the condition of globalism. And from these movements and resistances, there has also been several answers proposed. Yesterday at DAI, the master department in Arnhem, we discussed the notion of the Fourth World War proposed by Subcommandante Marcos of the Zapatista uprisings now 20 years ago, who specifically argued that the survival of the indigenous people in Chiapas is something that does not stand as a goal in itself, but can only exist in solidarity with struggles of indigenous people worldwide, the struggle for the survival of history as such against the generic forces of neoliberalist culture, cultural imperialism, etc., that also relates to forces like the Naxalites in India that's context that you were referring to as well. So where's the element of internationalism, apart from you as a subject that moves internationally, who responds or reflects on the idea of indigeneity through indigeneity itself, there's also been a practice of internationalism proposed, and where does that fit into your own discourse?
I'm still making notes. Is that okay?
For me, the first question I think is interesting, and it's one worth considering in terms of what happens to criticality once we're thinking about ecological crisis. And I think that the one danger is ecological emergency can force out modes of thinking critically about the world, and it can force us into a position where we embrace action. We want action rather than the distanced, protracted thought process of criticality. And I think that that's a real danger, and we can't give in to that. I think if anything, crisis makes criticality even more necessary, and especially in the way that Marina was defining it in relationship to the need to resist being subsumed into a kind of we that eliminates recognition of modes of inequality and dispossession and the differentiated aspects of environmental impact, geographically, politically, socially, culturally. So that's my response to the first question, which I think is a really important one to ask. The second one is the internationalism of indigeneity. Again, becoming indigenous is a crucial aspect of that is the forms of political solidarity that come about through the very process. So it's not about a form of exoticism or turning to the object as an idealized form of ecological living. There's a number of interesting studies about the dangers of constructing what's called the ecological Indian. Right, this goes back for a long time, but despite that discourse, like I said, it's crucial to try to develop forms of solidarity, and the ones that I was pointing to, like Idle No More, is a great example. And I'm glad that you raised the Zapatistas as well, because they're another perfect example of an indigenous movement, largely, that retains its cultural autonomy and singularity, yet is also very much invested in developing forms of solidarity that are international, not only between other indigenous groups in Latin America, but also globally, as well as in relationship to social movements. Now, for me, in general, my interest in all of this is coming from a sense of just exhaustion and a sense of a kind of alienation of being a singular academic within a university environment, theorizing about ecology. I think for me that's really there's a lot of limitations with that. So I think it's increasingly important, in terms of, again, becoming indigenous, to do so through the engagement in social movements and looking for forms of solidarity that one can be a part of and struggle towards, and become indigenous in that way. Again, as people are suggesting, as Idle No More invites, as the Zapatistas demand, as Vandana Shiva writes about, as many other people. Eduardo Viveros de Castro is a really interesting figure. There's many others, but for me, that's what it means.
I mean, I would echo, in response to the first question about critique, I would echo a lot of what TJ had said. And I guess, what's maybe could be generative to think about is, in a way, the project of critique and the project of modernity. Critique and nature are both projects of modernity, in a sense, and critique, insofar as it reproduces this split, cannot think critique at the level of the globe, cannot think critique through the whole kind of troubling and paradoxical and kind of ungraspable scale at which it has to unfold nowadays, because the scale of sort of crisis, considered at the scale of the globe, or the sort of destruction of nature, both as an epistemic and as a kind of empirical entity, itself kind of immobilizes critique, both through this kind of discourse of emergency, but also because the conditions of possibility, say kind of relative autonomy of institutions, is also where critique was generated. is also very much being absorbed into a kind of degradations of sort of conditions of reproduction socially as well as environmentally. So critique as a project which kind of comes out of the nature society split characteristic of modernity is perhaps not viable. But we can also juxtapose that perhaps to other versions of critique which also emerged from modernity, which saw nature precisely as being produced through this separation, nature and society being produced through this separation, and therefore critique being a sort of way of thinking transformation from the point of view of the abolition of that separation. And I would, I guess, say that certainly not all variants of kind of Marxian critique or materialist critique have taken on that challenge or been interested in it, but a lot perhaps have been or can be thinking, and the kind of materialist approach, I think, would have to take into account the crisis of the conditions of critique in as much as something, an object called crisis. At least that's what I've been trying to develop in this presentation or in my work.
Alexei?
I was going maybe quite briefly to tackle the question, which was not so subtle like Adorno, but more related to what Maja and Reuben was saying about Stalinist approach to nature. It's a different version of thinking, of course, than Adorno, nice and subtle. But still, I think that it's very interesting that Stalinist thought and Diamat, what is called, had actually very specific relation to nature, because the Diamat as a set of specific dialectical laws, sort of usually interpreted as a sort of vulgarized, interpreted Hegel, and so on and so on, included nature. So dialectical laws was somehow capturing nature too. So, for example, the law of transition from quantity to quality was also addressed to nature. So it was deeply, I mean, in this sense, it was sort of deeply ecological thinking. Stalinist Diamat. And for example, also in a sense, it was sort of very faithful to Hegel, for example. If you will open the Philosophy of Nature volume from Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, and you could just get immediately feeling of intellectual excitement and enjoyment reading how Hegel, for example, discuss transition from plants to animals via mediation of mushrooms, for example. So it's very, I mean, it's quite the same way. And in this sense, I think it actually also addressing to what was said here about this ecological thinking and this learning to live with other being and all this quite rhetorical device. I mean, also in a way, if we go very quickly to this deconstruction of what could be called deconstruction between nature and culture and so on, it also could be in a sort of Stalinist thinking again, because as for example, if you take if you endow the human animals or plants with rights or include them in some legislative apparatus, so it also means that it could be also, because in legislative system there is also a conflictual situation. For example, if Bruno Latour, he discussed in pasteurization of France, for example, how the struggle with bacteria was started in the 19th century. Actually, it was a response to the whole medieval struggle of this bacteria, which was sort of in European medieval ages, when plague or epidemic diseases provoked by bacteria was a sort of massacres of thousands of human beings. So it could be sort of also a sort of response and quite warlike relationship with nature presupposed by this approach. So it just for example, so I mean this. I mean, we probably really need more subtle models of these theorizing these relations, and as Marina was saying about this notion of mimesis or some sort of very distinctive specific mechanisms of relations to nature. And also I would just note that what you said about provocative about Spengler, also it could be included in more general discourse about decline of the West, of course. So it started with, I don't know, Nietzsche in 19th century, many thinking around in Heidegger and whatever. So Spengler was maybe particular because in his very conservative, proto-fascist maybe thinking, he was addressing exactly the term of the West in the title, but you can find a lot of this sort of this thinking around, and probably generally we can discuss since I don't know, since Giambattista Vico and even earlier. So we could discuss in Arnold Toynbee, for example. We can find all this discussion about the beginning, flourishing, and decay of civilization, including the West, and so on and so on. So it's big, but at the same time, I think it would be interesting to trace this ambivalency of this notion of decline, because usually you can find this in the very origins of this discourse sort of ambivalency when decline is implied in the very beginning. So it's probably a sort of reaction of some foundational event which splits the West and provoke this. So, but we could expand on this next.
So would you?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so there have been attempts to reread the Stalin's policies to environment and to see him as you know, kind of a conservationist. And recently there have been articles published on Stalinist environmentalism, and really seeing him as a kind of affirmative figure in protection of the certain environments in Soviet Union, and it's true that they did put in law some of the aspects in the protection of the nature in these laws that existed. And it's what is interesting is that only in 2006 they were abolished by Putin, and.
So the law on the protection of forests that they did have, it was this very weak law from the 30s that the Stalin's constitution had. Putin completely abolished that law and, in fact, the Agency for the Protection of the Environment. So it's another kind of irony of how things have actually got worse in the kind of post-communist period in that regard.
Yeah, but on the other, I mean, even Dipesh Chakrabarty decides to quote at length Stalin in this climate history, which is interesting. But then, do we want to think about Stalin in terms of the theory or in terms of practice? You know, this is the question. Do we think about the environmental histories of the territory and the impact he had on it, or do we want to think of his immaterial labor?
Exactly because.
Wait a minute.
2 points. I mean, just exactly because theoretically he included the nature in dialectical totality, that this relation to nature as an object of radical transformation became possible. So I mean, it's theoretically very deeply connected with the practice, and generally it was a lot of pre-Stalinist ecological thinking, like in writers like Andrei Platonov, or you can find this in Sergei Tretyakov in relation to objects and nature, like writing biographies of object or whatever it's, but we can discuss it later.
And I mean, also, I mean, there's the theoretical precursors, but also in practical terms, in terms of environmentalism, also in Russia, also in the 1920s, and even right through the Stalinist and Soviet period, there was a whole movement around, I think, the Zapovedniks, that they had these areas that were protected wild areas, kind of biospheres, and they really, with the Soviet Union, actually really pioneered this idea of the biosphere that no one could go into, where there were, which in a way corresponds to this definition of rewilding of wilderness, like areas where a natural process were allowed to carry on. So, but a lot of these things somehow survive somehow accidentally, rather than as a result of the theory. Also, maybe on the one hand, you can say, okay, it's part of it reflects, the Stalinist policy reflects a certain attitude to theory and to Marxism, but I think also there's an element which is less conscious or less rational, and then this somehow I don't know if it's fear of nature or viewing nature as an enemy, the need to dominate nature, and to extend power from beyond, not only to every reach of society, but also to the natural world, also went beyond a purely kind of rational or theoretical explanation.
Yeah, and if we want to think about this kind of maybe some aspects of positive side to the period of Soviet Union, it's precisely in these areas which were left unmanaged, which were left neglected, and where the system was inefficient, that some of the things managed to survive. And one of the books is called Little Corners of Freedom, and this is perhaps where we should look more for something relevant for today as well.
If there are no more, yes, okay. One last. There are few more minutes. Okay.
I really enjoyed this panel. I have so many questions I would like to ask, but I'm just trying to connect the relationship between what we're doing by inhabiting a space of art by having this conversation. So one question, well, it's not really a question, but I observe how the role of art history, first of all, in aging political wishes, which I really enjoyed from your second presentation. And the question around Australia, I also refrained from talking about that, but I come from a very Stalin-esque city in Queensland in Australia, and the lack of conversation around the neoliberal project in Australia is extremely remarkable, I think. And I wanted to bring that back into the conversation around indigeneity by one example. So the example is the relationship between the aftermath of Indigenous land rights movements, as in the emotional aftermath, not the actual aftermath, and the relationship of a previously conservative farming agricultural populace to that history as a result of the negative commons created by the fracking movement in the US, but also in Australia and other places. And it sort of brings to the fore how clean some of our conversations are about the commons when we think that it is a concept that we all understand, first of all, but also the resort to Indigenous knowledge and not the Indigenous negotiation when we start to talk about the value, like the literal, we go straight to the conversation about the value of knowledge rather than the practice, the sticky practice of negotiating the politics of that orientation towards an incredibly historically antagonistic common practice. And I was wondering, as a process of all that, I've been really interested in finding artists that make art about this sort of meeting or commoning that is happening around these like extremely territorial, eco-destructive spatializations of new relationships that set up negative commons that actually reflect extremely productively on what neoliberalism actually achieved. And I'm not sure that I've actually asked a question, but maybe there's comments.
Shall we leave it as a comment and the possible reaction also leave for the final discussion with respondents after the second or third panel? And let's close for now this discussion. You are all invited to Bach.
To Bach.
There will
for
be
some
something.
Sandwiches, drinks. We have a terrace, so there's a hope. So you're all invited. Please join us. And thank you very much, Boris,
And yes,
and all the speakers.
it was easy with these so interesting participants. Thank you.